Our guest today has the toughest job in state government. Before you start saying the governor, but I want to tell one quick story about our speaker today, because it affects the City Club. He came to me about 4 or 5 years ago and said, Jay, I need someone who otherwise wouldn't be able to get a job, and if you got any interns, because you know we pay zero over there, essentially. I suggest a young man. That young man today is in a senior type position in the governor's, in Mr. Filan's operation. He's not here today, but it shows you what kind of person, because this person was a great student at DePaul, all kinds of financial aid. He's a wonderful, wonderful, bright young man. But for John Filan, he would not have a position. His name is Brian Fimple. So if you ever need, you can't get a hold of John, call Brian Fimple and say I said to give him a call. He's down in Springfield now working. But anyway, so I want to thank John. Some might argue that the governor has the toughest job. That is really not true. And I will tell you why. Our guest today has to say no far more often than the governor ever does. That is because the governor can say, John, find it. Our guest today is the director of the governor's Office of Management and Budget. Our guest today holds an MBA from the University of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the City Club of Chicago the director of the governor's Office of Management and Budget, John Filan. John?
Thanks, Jay. Is the microphone high enough, or should I adjust it? Is that better? Okay. You know, that comment about saying no and the governor saying yes is more like when someone tells me that, I try to call and say, did he really say yes, or did he say, we'll take a look at it? It sounds good to me, okay? I think it's an interesting idea, and I find out more often that the yes is what people thought they heard, but it was more like, that's an interesting idea, we'll look into it. And then just kind of wrestle from there. But I think in fairness, as much as government is a pretty aggressive place these days, I would only disagree on one point. I think the governor does have the hardest job because ultimately he has to bear the responsibility for it. And usually when he refers to the budget, he says very clearly that, you know, if this budget works, it's my budget, and if it doesn't work, it's Filan's budget. In any event, Jay, thanks so much. I didn't know I'd have to go to this great length to get a free lunch out of Jay Doherty, but that's what it takes. And before we get started, I want to thank Jay and Paul for having the state here and me on their behalf to discuss a little bit with you this year's budget and a little bit how next year's outlook is. But I want to spend most of the time trying to take some of your questions, since I know a lot of the people in this room are very knowledgeable in the state budget and have a lot of involvement with it. And so rather than go through a lot of information you may already know, I'm going to try to allow as much time as possible for questions. I do want to recognize a couple of people that clearly the governor and myself could not do this job without them. And a couple of them are here, a couple of them are not. Jay already mentioned Brian Fimple. He's a very young guy that we hired in the firm I was with several years ago at Jay's recommendation. He did an outstanding job there. He's now Director of Financial Management with the state and really oversees in his very youthful years the whole financial reporting system of how this budget's actually doing, a system that wasn't there a few months ago. In addition, I don't know if Dave Abel is here or not. Dave is from LaSalle Street, formerly UBS Payne Weber, and I think most that are in the business here would consider Dave by far the #1 financial expert you could possibly get involved in what we do on the debt side in the state. And to say Dave has done a great job is a gross understatement. He is remarkable. He told me yesterday on the phone, and those of you who know Dave, yesterday on the phone is a normal thing on Sunday. There's not a minute of the 7-day week that I have not gotten an email from Dave when I wake up in the morning or go to bed at night. But he said he was invited by at least 6 or 7 of all of you to come here and felt terribly conflicted about coming. I encouraged him to come, but apparently he chose to do what he usually does, is work, work, work. I also want to mention Ron Pacour, who Jay already mentioned. Ron clearly also is somebody who's put in time that's imaginable, but more importantly, quality. Between Dave, Brian, and Ron, and several other people have really made this an experience that is worthwhile. You don't often recognize the vendor community, and many of you are out there that have worked with us closely, especially in transition. A lot of the people that worked with us in transition are in the audience today. I do want to mention 3 people, though, that were helpful both in transition and helpful in a very arduous process when we had to make some very quick and difficult and we think good decisions in the whole area of debt management. And that's Larry Morris, his close cousin Bill Morris. I'm not sure Bill's here today. They're actually not related. And Lois Scott. Larry's out here and Lois here, and all those people, I really appreciate it very much. My notes here say that I'm supposed to talk about my background. I don't really want to do that, but I do want to mention that I was and still am a very proud member of the Galway Committee. And I was told to say that, and I'm very proud to say that with Bill Gaynor out there. In any event, I just got back from recently the National Budget Directors meeting in Washington, D.C. And they, of course, had the meeting on Saturday and Sunday. Not Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, not Saturday, Sunday, Monday, but Saturday and Sunday. So I told our office, I said, see, those other people, they're worse than me. They have no concept of the work week. But we got some very, very excellent presentations by the Congressional Budget Office, by Senator Frist's office, and a number of other senior governmental people as well as analysts on where the economy is going, where the national budget is going. And as much as we have great concerns here in Illinois, and we are not out of the woods yet, and you'll certainly hear that refrain from me, when you hear the explanation of the $480 billion deficit for next year at the federal level, and you hear the assumptions behind that 480, let me assure you, according to their own people, and it's not a partisan comment at all, 480 is on the very low side when you hear that. So that tells 2 things. One, the economy remains having a ways to go despite some good news. And secondly, in terms of additional opportunities for the states, the message from them is, don't think about it. And when you have that message in the budget process, in this last spring, I of course was a broken record and like a tape recorder saying, I'm interested, but we have no money. And everybody would invariably say, we understand there's no money. We understand that it's not available. However, and then they would always have their however, their program was something to consider. And it reminded me of the same thing I just heard in Washington this last weekend, or 2 weekends ago in the meeting, when everybody said basically they understood the party was over, but could we have just one more drink? And I'll tell you, that's what budgeting is all about, is how do you not take one more drink? And that was the hardest thing I think we had to do in Springfield, is really make those difficult choices. The state's deficit was historic. I know you all know that. Some of it was economic, meaning the times and where the economy is. Some of it's structural, that's been there for years, particularly in healthcare expenditures, to some extent expenditures in education, and to a very large extent our state pension systems, which, as most of you know, are the worst funded in the country. When the governor took office, he clearly had to be in a position to make very difficult choices and make very quick choices. And part of that was doing some very aggressive cost-saving reductions, and part of it was major budget and management reforms. I mentioned before that we're not out of the woods yet. This is not something we're going to turn around in one fiscal year or one financial year. It's not unlike any aircraft carrier, and certainly Illinois is an aircraft carrier when it comes in terms of size. Aircraft carriers don't make U-turns, nor does the state, but we think, have it going in the right direction. This deficit did not happen overnight. It didn't just happen last year. It happened not just because there was a financial downturn. It didn't happen just because a particular program had heavy inflation. It happened for a series of reasons over many years. And what I'd like to share with you is a couple of things that I think is important for us to watch going forward. And one of our themes is maintaining fiscal discipline throughout the year. The warning signs were there in the last few years, but the state organizationally was not in a position to react. You could see in fiscal year '01, '02, and '03, revenues declining, revenues flattening out, revenues far below the assumed budget, yet there was no mechanism in place to adjust spending to accommodate that revenue deterioration. And so consequently, in coming into office in February, not only was there a $5 billion deficit made up of roughly $1.2 billion for fiscal year '03 and $3.6 billion, if you will, the recurring deficit in fiscal year '04, totaling almost $5 billion. But there was also a series of what I refer to as hidden deficits. That is, shortages of money that you don't see in the budget itself. The state owed over $1 billion and was expected to owe almost $1.9 billion in unpaid medical bills as of June 30th, '03, when we came into office. The income tax refund fund had not been funded in the last several years, such there was $800 million of unpaid income taxes in the state of Illinois. The Medicaid system had not been properly budgeted in the last 3 years and only had minor increases, so that consequently a lot of Medicaid bills had gotten deferred into future budgets. It's a relatively easy thing to do in the Medicaid budget. You just adjust the payment cycle and pay slower, as many of you in this room have experienced, and just put the bill off into next year, and the Medicaid budget looks a little bit better. And finally, and I think our greatest challenge going forward from a financial spending point of view, not so much revenue point of view, is the state's pension systems. You all know in this room, I think, that we took a dramatic and important step in the spring by issuing the pension obligation bond. We were fortunate for a variety of reasons to sell that bond in the first week in June. We were in the lowest 2 weeks of interest rates in almost 50 years in this country, and consequently sold that bond at under 5.05% on a weighted basis. What that means is we put the states in a position to have a tremendous opportunity to improve on the pension systems. But even with that dramatic action, even with a $10 billion bond issue and putting advance funding into pension systems of $8 billion, and I'm saying that for emphasis for a reason, even after doing that, Illinois remains the worst funded pension system in this country. We are 50 out of 50 states. And it's because the state of Illinois, unlike most of the other states, did not fund the system or underfunded it for almost 25 years and made choices to fund other things instead. So that remains a major obstacle for every budget year, is how we address pension funding before we can get through K through 12, before we can get to Medicaid, before we can get to public safety, is how we deal with pensions. And I'll come back on that a little bit more, and I'm sure there might be some questions on it as well. The fourth thing that we faced is the state had also gone on a very major capital spending program. Well-intended, important for job creation, important for infrastructure development, but one that was adopted in a period where revenues started to decline, and the combination of increased capital spending together with paying off debt on a front-loaded basis caused debt service to increase very quickly when revenues weren't there to pay for it. So much of what's been adopted, whether it was early retirement that included increased benefits to retirees, or whether it included major capital expansion, were adopted without an eye towards revenues, whether or not there was money there to pay for it. And so the question often happens is when we do these things, they're great ideas, but where's the revenue? What are you going to pay for it for? And a big part of our responsibility is trying to make that picture clearer going forward. Some of the cost savings we took upon taking office, I'll just mention briefly. Immediately upon taking office, the governor put in place across-the-board reductions in all agencies and administrative spending, and also reserved over $700 million on other spending to try to protect the remainder of fiscal year '03. I think it was the second day in office, he ordered an immediate hiring freeze to seize the opportunity of the early retirement program. I can tell you that as a result of that, the state's headcount is and will be at the lowest level since 1983. And we adopted a budget to have the headcount be not more than 63,000 employees. As we are here today, we are still below 60,000, so we feel very comfortable that we will hit that goal in doing so. We also did a number of major consolidations of state functions. The 7,000 facilities the city owns and manages in respective departments, whether it's hospitals, offices, or child care centers or prisons, are now being moved to one agency so we can have a very focused effort on energy management, maintenance, and trades operations. And we're also centralizing all the fee consolidation in the state. The state collects over 1,000 fees in 40 different departments, and we want to move those, as the city has done many years ago, into a single department of revenue. Going forward in the fiscal year '04 budget, we had adopted a number of steps under the rubric of fiscal discipline. One of the first ones is to implement a 2% reserve in all funds in the state. We actually have that in place. They are written agreements with every single agency director, signed by that director in our office, that it sets aside over $700 million of their budget unavailable for spending. So their clear understanding is to only plan on spending 98% of their budget. That 2% is not available. So we have something physically in place from day one to manage the inevitable bumps in the road that you experience in every budget. Two of the tougher decisions this governor made was eliminating the state paying the employees' pension contribution. It's something we believe should not have ever been done, but it was done 12 years ago with the intention of it being for 1 year. And that decision alone that means that state pays the employee's share of the pension contribution of 8.5% of their payroll. That issue alone it costs the state several $100 million. We've eliminated that for employees who are not in bargaining units. That's about 11,000 employees, and that together with having no pay raises this year has an additional reserve of $42 million in the budget. We also put in place quarterly allotments, which basically means that if you don't spend all the money you're allotted in a given quarter, you don't get it back automatically. We reserve it, and you have to come in and negotiate for it if you want it back. We also closed a number of, and I'm sure many of you aware of them, corporate and individual tax exemptions, or loopholes as they're sometimes called, on the sales and income tax side. They were about $300 million, and as controversial as some of those were, as an alternative to raising the income tax, we felt they were far more desirable. There are almost $4 billion of those exemptions in Illinois' tax code, and I can assure you that we'll be looking at all of those once again going forward. We also put in place an administrative chargeback system. Illinois is famous for a lot of things. We have the most governments in the country, almost 7,000. We also have the most governmental funds in the state government. We have almost 600. None of those funds pay for the administrative cost of government, meaning the cost of the governor's office, the General Assembly, the controller's office, the treasurer's office, as well as the purchasing function. Many of them don't pay for office space. And as a consequence, the general fund pays that money. And the importance, I think, to our office and this audience, hopefully, is that the general fund is the money that pays for K through 12, pays for health care to the indigent, pays for public safety. So every time one of those funds does not pay their fair share of administration, that's at the expense of K through 12 and health care, and that's the importance of doing that on a going forward basis. We also increased the number of non-consumer fees. We found that, according to a report by the Illinois Controller done recently, about 18 months ago, that the average per capita fee in the 50 states was about $110. In Illinois, it was about $40. So it was clearly, we're a low-income tax state. We want to keep it that way, but you can't be in a abnormally low fee state as well. And so we raised a lot of fees to be competitive and at the same level of our Midwestern neighbors. We also made some major debt management reforms going forward. Probably the single most important one was to allow the state to issue variable rate debt, especially in this low interest rate market. In the past, the state was limited to issuing only fixed rate debt, and that meant that we could only sell to fixed rate buyers. So that meant they gave you an offer and you said yes or no. Now we have the opportunity to go elsewhere in the market to sell our debt, and we just did that last week with the help of many of you in this room, and had a very successful offering that not only gave the state a present value savings of over 4% on the bonds selected, but actually saved some money in this year's budget in excess of $100 million as a result of doing it. Going forward, just a brief comment on how the budget looks so far. The entire budget is an estimate, every revenue, every spending category in there. You can't tell too much from the first quarter, but basically all the national economists that we work with regularly, as well as our Council of Economic Advisors, that I should mention. It's 4 independent people from both parties on an uncompensated basis. Jim Annabelle, one of the most renowned economists in the country, formerly with CBO and chief economist to Bank One and worked with Clark, I know. Paula Wolf, who was the chief policy advisor to Governor Jim Thompson. David Chacoin, agricultural economist with the University of Illinois. And John Rogers, the president of Aerial Management. And that group, literally, in this budget process, are the ones that developed and signed off on all of the economic assumptions we use to project revenues. And the importance of that is we wanted to put integrity in the revenue process and not make it just a political assumption in the process of doing spending decisions. That council meets with us at least monthly. They feel pretty good about their assumptions. Every single one of our assumptions are below what economists are currently assuming, so we think we're still in pretty good shape. Generally speaking, the last several years are not good indicators to project this year because some of those years were either very aggressively up or very aggressively down. Generally speaking, in the first quarter, revenues are about 20% of the full fiscal year, but that's not a good indicator for the reason I just mentioned. There are some signs of weakness. The 10th gaming license remains still up in the air. That's in the court system. Every week I hear one more, under the table story that it's going to happen. I'm not planning on it, but if it does, it'll happen someday and it'll be great for the state. Overall, gaming revenues are down. They will be up over last year, but less than we expected in the budget. We are having an interesting challenge with the gaming industry in Illinois, and we expect that will continue throughout. So we will get more revenues out of it, but not what we'd like. On the other hand, income tax, although it is down, it is about what we budgeted. We actually budgeted income tax for less than fiscal year '02, believing that it was still a jobless recovery. Sales tax, on the other hand, is showing some life. It's up over 1% overall for the first quarter and 4% in September. 1 month doesn't make a year, but October has also been a very good month in sales tax as well, and so we feel good about the data you see in the economy having near-term results on the sales tax side. Most of our fees are moving along as scheduled. Those fees, although they don't increase, they are pretty stable, and they are meeting targets in the first quarter. So overall, we think we're moving along as expected. It'll be a tight budget to manage. It'll have its ups and downs. But this budget doesn't just rely on revenues. There's also spending. One of the tough choices this year was how do we keep our commitment to certain areas, to certain themes the governor committed to in this period where we have such a crisis. We did increase substantially K through 12 funding, as well as health care to the indigent, in particular kid care, senior care, and child care eligibility. We did increase certain areas of public safety, but after doing that, we reduced the budgets outright of 38 departments, boards, and commissions in the state that did not meet those core areas of K through 12 education, health care, and public safety. One of the things we're doing very aggressively is managing the state's cash flow, because we know how important it is in a period of no rate increases for the medical community to be paid on time or close to on time. Our budget says we don't want to go out more than 60 days. We're shooting for an average of 40. The last couple of months, it's been in the low 30s in terms of payment cycles for medical providers. I hope those of you out here are feeling that. We speak with the Comptroller's Office and the Public Aid Office every single week, twice a week, to see what happened last week, this week, and next week, so we can try to fulfill that commitment to the providers out there. What this comes down to, and I think the central message that we'd like to both talk about next week in veto session and going forward, is we've got to keep the fiscal discipline in place in Illinois. There's a very important chart that we presented to the rating agencies that were just out there last week with Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's, and I'm pleased to say they reaffirmed our ratings. And the one they paid the most attention to was the one that was a 20-year chart that showed total spending and showed that spending flattening out these last couple of years. That increases in Illinois spending have far outpaced the Consumer Price Index and most other indexes in the last 10 and 15 years. And these last couple of years, we're finally turning that out where we're actually managing underneath that kind of an index. Next year, as you probably have read, we do expect to face a structural deficit of between $1.5 and $2 billion. That reflects still meeting our commitments to pensions. It reflects still meeting our commitment to Medicaid, as well as commitments to K through 12. And part of that is going to be how well we do in keeping that fiscal discipline in place and keeping spending in place in this veto session. Clearly, there's a lot of justifiable and understandable hunger out there for more resources in certain areas, but we still are not out of the woods. Fiscal discipline is what we have to have in place. I ask your support in doing that. Budgets are about funding priorities. We can't do every good thing. The test really has to be affordability. And we think if we keep that fiscal discipline in place this year and next year, as the economy rebounds, and most think it will next year, on the employment side, we can have a healthy budget process again. In the meantime, we're deeply in the woods, but we're sawing every tree in sight. And I'm happy to be here today, and I'll end my discussion for now and be happy to take any of your questions. Thank you very much.
We have a microphone there. Line up on the microphone. Please make your question short. If you want to make a speech, contact me. We'll see if we can have you one of our lunches. A lot of vendors here, Mr. Filan.
The answer's still no.
All right, this, I'll bow it. Sandbagging's okay, but you have to state your name.
Okay. Rick Smith with the Energy Systems Group. Good afternoon. Have a question for you in regards to higher education. You touched a little bit on K-12 education, and we noticed over the last couple of years the appropriations being taken away, and yet the increase in student population and the increased need for infrastructure improvements. I wonder if there is some type of plan down the road for that, for the improvement, for more capital appropriations for the state institutes.
Can the answers be short, too? You know, the higher education part of the budget includes many elements. It's the university system, the community college system, as well as the Student Assistance Commission that provides the scholarships to students attending universities in Illinois and elsewhere. I think our first priority last year, and remains the same this year, is funding the scholarship program, the MAP program in the state, particularly for low-income students attending. That really will come first in the budgeting process. The community colleges and the university systems are ones that we work with very closely. The Board of Higher Education has been successful this year in getting further reductions in administrative spending to be redirected into the classroom. So we do think we'll see some improved classroom spending in this year's budget. And we will be doing some university expansions and maintenance jobs in the capital budget. But I think the best answer I can give you right now is the scholarship funding will come first in the higher education process. And we'll look to that administrative cost reduction program the Board of Higher Ed is undertaking themselves through Jim Kaplan, the chairman, as ways to get more money into the classroom. One of the things about universities, unlike many parts of the budget, and I recognize there's limits on everything, is that they do have other places they can raise money. And so in that context, we try to work with them and with their entire budget process, just not the state appropriation. The state's only about 1/4 of their entire spending.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is very tall. My name is Chris Long. I'm a member of the City Council Board. My question, John, is about how do you maintain fiscal discipline if the folks in Washington don't, since they are divesting responsibilities to the states? For example, Head Start just this past week has been very much in the press. How will you be able to project your future, our state's future, if the feds in Washington give us stuff that they have funded in the past?
I for sure don't have a short answer for that. You know, I can think of a couple of recent examples. One of the things we struggle with in the state's revenue system is that our income taxes are based on either adjusted gross income for individuals or taxable income for corporations. That number gets defined and redefined, usually downward, annually, by the federal government. So consequently, the principal base on which you determine these percents that we have for income taxes is a function of a number that's being driven downward. So that's one aspect of how the federal government operates that affects the state. Another one most recently is this debate you've seen about what's misleadingly called the internet tax. There are 9 states now that tax access to the internet. not the content of the internet, but access to it. Illinois does not. The bill pending in Congress is one that would prohibit permanently, right now it's a temporary one, states and cities, and this mayor and this governor have indicated that they're opposed to it, being able to tax the internet in any way. Now, it's interesting that the bill does not prevent the federal government from taxing the internet. It only exempts the people out in the hinterlands in doing so. And the problem with it, as an example, is that we all have a telephone tax, locally and statewide. MCI is committed to have 100% of their voice communications on the internet in the near term. If that bill passed as it was there, and MCI did that, then the telephone tax would disappear. That's the same kind of unfunded mandate that you're referring to, and we experience it especially in the education area. The No Child Left Behind Act is not even remotely funded close to what it requires, and I'm sure Arnie Duncan and others have told you that, to the point that it's not even a discussion, and yet nonetheless, you know, there's no interest in doing anything about it. So I don't have a good solution other than working hard with our congressional delegation to use Illinois' leverage to get a better share of the pie than they have been in the past. And we do that diligently. The governor's out there often, works closely with Speaker Hastert, and we hope to see some fruits to bear. We just recently had some good news in the Medicaid area that we think is helpful to the state, but otherwise it's a difficult, difficult time.
Thanks.
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night at 8:30 on CAN TV, Channel 21. And tonight's show, we have 10 United States Senate candidates on, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. What could be more fair and balanced than that? Direct-
That's the only exception to my rule, is Berkowitz, it's called the Berkowitz Law.
Fair and balanced, right. Okay. Direct.
Emphasis on the word right. Go ahead.
We'll give him the last word. Director Filan, I think you handed out, there was a chart for us as we came in today showing appropriations growth since 1980. And as I read it, the last 23 years, the average rate of growth for appropriations or spending in the state of Illinois, was this, I assumed it was coming from your office? Didn't mean to sandbag it, even though.
Yes, it's not a
Totally.
sandbag. We actually used it. This is what I was referring to that Standard & Poor's and Moody's were
Okay,
very
that's,
focused on.
so if that shows 23, excuse me, an average rate of growth in appropriations for the last 23 years for total appropriations in Illinois of 13% per year, and the consumer price index averaged 5% per year, are you thinking at all, I know that last year, obviously, the rate of growth declined so significantly to 1%. Are you thinking over the next 2 or 3 years to balance things out, perhaps we should have a few years of negative growth? And irrespective of your answer to that, what are you projecting over the next 3 or 4 years in terms of the Office of Management and Budget as to the rate of growth for appropriations? Do you have a 3 or 4 or 5 year plan that suggests 2% rate of growth, 3%, minus 3%? What's your projection?
We do look out between 3 and 5 years on a regular basis, and particularly we look at 05 as we do in 04. I think the focus is there's certain areas that we know we need to or want to increase, the same ones we increased in this last budget. K through 12, once again, medical care for the indigent, largely in Medicaid, and certain areas of public safety. Some of those increases have to come at the expense of other programs rather than from revenues, because the revenues simply aren't there. So the extent to which there are increases, there'll be increases in areas such as that. But overall, I think in the near term, meaning at least next fiscal year, we're looking at a very flat budget in terms of spending. And most of the increases I just mentioned will have to come from reducing other areas.
Well, what would it be overall for the next 3 to 5 years in terms of rate of increase or decrease?
I don't know that I can tell you that right now, since we're at the initial stages of developing the fiscal year 05 budget, and that's partly what the governor's responsibility is, to put that proposal in place in doing so. I can tell you that, you know, Medicaid without structural reform increases about 8.5% to almost 10% per year. It's actually less than it was before. we are making some structural changes there, including in the drug program that you've heard quite a bit about lately. Pensions is an area as well that has some built-in structural changes to it as a result of a lot of benefit increases that were unfunded. And that's an area that we have to continue to examine as to affordability and how we pay for those benefits in doing so. So I think in something as large as a $50 billion enterprise that has many components to it, it's a matter of choices. But the areas I mentioned will have to increase, but some of those increases will come from spending reductions.
Thank you. We'll look forward to continuing this discussion on my show.
Okay.
That was a question.
Thank you, Jeff.
Just a quick return to higher education. My name's Lucy Moros. I'm an old college president, now in corporate America with Campus Indirects. If you look at higher education, it's going to be increasingly difficult to do too much of tuition raising. It may be increasingly difficult to do too much fundraising within development. We know that across our nation, development dollars are now down in the alumni area by about 14%. But there is the area that the governor has talked about, and that is the indirect side of the budget. My question is the governor, or will you be bringing people together, corporate America, higher education, in order to formulate more plans to save money through the indirect side of the budget? I ask that specifically because the governor put together a very interesting group of people this past year that is looking at access, affordability, and accountability for higher education. Thank you very much.
I think it's a good question. On the access side, I think, as represented by our main focus in the scholarship area I mentioned earlier, we recently announced, I think about a month ago, a major effort on public-private partnerships that really gets the business community more married to, if you will, the university community. The governor, as part of that, has been going around the state announcing regional economic development plans, and so far has done the Northwest Rockford area and the Western Illinois area around Moline. Each one of those plans is tied very much to the resident university that's within the region in terms of being part of the economic engine that does that. So I think that's a big part of the budget. You know, universities do lots of things. In the aggregate, only about 27% of their total budgets is spent on classroom. So we're trying to, in these times, redirect money into the classrooms so that that portion of the budget can increase, but once again at the expense of other areas. And that's much of what the Board of Higher Education is doing. But I think in terms of real growth in the budget, it's going to have to come from those kind of partnerships and those kind of programs you mentioned. Okay.
Director Filan, my name is Anthony Cole. I'm Vice President at Haymarket Center, and I just want to pose a couple of issues for you to take under consideration. When you look at the large number of people going into the prisons, most of those people apparently are going in for drug-related charges, and I want to applaud the governor and his administration in looking at the Sheridan Project as a model for improving the treatment, if you will, of people in prisons. But I also want to ask that there be a further look at that issue, particularly as it relates to Department of Children and Family Services. I think if you look at the data there, you'll see that the preponderance of the people who are involved with neglect and abuse charges, even deaths of infants, are primarily associated with their addictions. So I'd like to, as you look at how tight things are fiscally, if you look for ways of having cost offsets, I hope that this administration will further look at the issue of substance abuse as a primary driver in terms of people going into the prison system, and also the people getting involved with the Department of Children and Family Services for neglect and abuse of children. Thank you.
Thank you. What I do know is in a field that I don't know a lot about, I do know that the Sheridan reopening is a major first step
Yes.
in that direction, and there is a lot of emphasis on the preventative aspects of what you've just outlined.
Right.
And one of the struggles is when you do preventative actions is there's a bubble, if you will, because you have to keep doing what you are doing while you invest in the new program, and
Right.
it's hard to do both, but
Right.
you're right on the mark, and I think no one disagrees that much of our situation in the prisons has to do with a drug orientation.
Yes, and like I said, the Department of Children and Family Services, similar correlations between addiction and women and adult males as well as getting involved in abuse and neglect of the children. So I'm just trying to urge you that as you look at these tight fiscal arrangements or situations, to look at that more clearly, because I believe that is a primary driver if you look at the data in terms of Department of Children and Family Service cases as well as corrections. Thank you.
Carmen, to close.
I'm Carmen Kelder. I'm the owner of CPC Electrical Supply Company. John, a much simpler question. How are we, the state of Illinois, doing fiscally in comparison to other major states in the country?
Well, at least based on the meeting I was at, this budget directors meeting, the only state that confessed to a surplus was North Dakota. So we
I
formed
said major states.
well, from their point of view, and we formed an immediate line to try to annex them if we could, but and all we got of agreement is they wouldn't go to Canada. But in any event, most of the states that were there, we all kind of gave our little 10-minute story, so to speak, on what we went through and where we're at. We're primarily concerned on the uncertainty in revenues, and particularly Midwestern states, on the not very good forecast from consensus economists on the job side. What we've been told basically is that to expect some improvement this quarter, next quarter, but very modest, almost not discernible. And by the spring quarter of next year, something that is significant.
Yeah.
But once again, that's an expectation. I'd say that virtually every budget director felt that they were very nervous about their revenue forecast. A lot of states are more dependent than Illinois is on income and sales taxes. Some states, their general fund, their operating fund, if you will, 90% of the revenues come from those two sources. So consequently, the income tax is the one that's dead in the water. Whereas Illinois, one thing we are fortunate on, we do have a more diversified revenue base these days, some of which we improved last year and also before that, where income and sales tax is slightly less than 2/3 of the general fund. So we do have some balance there that other states don't share. So I don't think we felt quite as dire regarding the current year as some states did, particularly California and Virginia and a few others. But on the whole, I think everyone remains very nervous about the income tax revenue source.
Okay, Brian, last question.
Hi, Director. This question is relative to
State
the
your name, Brian. Everyone doesn't know you.
Brian Bernardoni, Director of Government Affairs for the Chicago Association of Realtors. Relative to the Department of Homeland Security, how is Illinois faring competitive to the other 50 states as far as embracing the mandates coming down from the federal government? And what kind of contingency planning is the state doing relative to ongoing budget concerns with regards to Homeland Security?
It's a good question. Actually, we're just in the veto session. You will see a number of supplemental bills being put in to receive quite a bit of federal funding in both the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, as well as Department of Public Health for bioterrorism, and also in, I'm blanking now, but a third department. So I don't know how we compare to other states. I do know that we've received well over $100 million in federal funds from the Department of Homeland Security for a variety of preventative programs in those areas.
How about a nice round of applause?